the number of Americans who say, yes, I'm very happy with my life.
It seemed like the good times would never end. A booming economy, rising wealth, and growing prosperity. But what if it was all a lie?
What in the world is happening on Wall Street? We're down by between 3 and 4.5%.
We're down over 16%.
Down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
Traders say this is the craziest day they have ever seen in these markets.
It was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
Markets froze, banks failed, life crumbled. A storm of greed and negligence left millions wondering, how did it happen? This wasn't just numbers on a screen. These were homes, jobs, and futures destroyed overnight. But who was responsible, and why did they walk away? Was it greed, ignorance, or was the entire system built to fail? What really happened in 2008? The roots of the 2008 financial crisis extend back as far as the 1980s. During this period, the global financial landscape began to shift dramatically, laying the foundation for what would eventually become a global economic catastrophe. In the 1980s, under the leadership of President Ronald Reagan, the world witnessed a significant ideological shift. The government, once deeply involved in regulating the financial markets, started to loosen its grip. Deregulation became the guiding principle, with the belief that a free market, unencumbered by government intervention, would lead to greater economic growth. This shift allowed banks to take on more risky financial products without oversight, pushing them further into speculative markets. By loosening regulations on the savings and loan, banks were allowed to make high-risk loans with little accountability. By the late 1980s, thousands of savings and loans institutions collapsed. The crisis cost taxpayers over $124 billion and revealed the dangerous consequences of letting financial institutions operate without restraint. But despite the crisis, the message was clear. Deregulation was here to stay. It was the beginning of a much larger and more devastating financial story. As the 1990s unfolded, homeownership became more than a dream. It became a national obsession. Advertisements proudly proclaimed that owning a home was the ultimate symbol of prosperity, with catchy slogans promising affordable housing for everyone. With rising wages and easy credit, the real estate market surged. For many Americans, a home was not just a place to live, it was an investment, a tangible sign of success in a booming economy. But behind the shiny new homes and skyrocketing property values, a new financial innovation was emerging: mortgage-backed securities. These products pooled home loans together and sold them to investors, spreading the risk and, in theory, making the housing market safer. But there was a darker side to this boom. Banks and mortgage lenders began offering loans to subprime borrowers. These loans were often given without proper checks to individuals who couldn't truly afford to repay them. Fueled by speculative buying and reckless lending, home prices soared to unprecedented levels. A bubble was forming, a dangerous period where home prices rose far beyond their actual value. Beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Subprime borrowers struggled to keep up with rising mortgage payments, and financial institutions were becoming increasingly exposed to the risks they thought were safely contained. As the 2000s dawned, the housing market became a frenzy of buying and selling. Investors and homeowners alike were swept up in a speculative fever. Flipping houses became the new gold rush, and risky loans like adjustable-rate mortgages made it easier than ever to join the party. But these easy loans came at a price. Adjustable-rate mortgages initially seemed affordable, but the low monthly payments would rise sharply after a few years, leaving borrowers struggling to make ends meet. At the same time, Wall Street was busy innovating. Banks turned home loans into complex financial products like mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations. These products were sold to investors worldwide, spreading the risk across borders. But these products weren't as safe as they seemed. The financial industry was gambling on the assumption that home prices would continue to rise. In reality, the entire global economy had become entangled in a web of risky bets that few truly understood. As the decade progressed, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Foreclosures soared, banks suffered massive losses, and the entire system began to unravel. By 2008, the warning signs were everywhere. and the world braced for a financial catastrophe. By September 2008, the financial system stood at the edge of an abyss. What had begun as cracks in the housing market had now spiraled into the most severe financial crisis since the Great Depression. The tipping point came on September 15, 2008, with the shocking collapse of Lehman Brothers.
Lehman Brothers suffering a spectacular downfall. Its stock at one point this year sold for
Lehman Brothers, a titan of Wall Street with a history stretching back over 150 years, was at the heart of the financial storm. Like many other banks, Lehman had bet heavily on complex financial instruments tied to the housing market. But when housing prices began to tumble in 2007, the value of these investments collapsed. Desperation set in. Lehman scrambled to raise capital and find a buyer, but as fear gripped the markets, no one was willing to take on its massive liabilities. In a controversial decision, the U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve declined to bail out Lehman, leaving it to declare bankruptcy with over $600 billion in debt.
It was the biggest bankruptcy in history and the tipping point into global recession.
Lehman's failure was a shock to a system already on the brink, and the ripple effects were swift and brutal. Lehman's collapse led a domino effect across the global financial system. Merrill Lynch, another Wall Street giant, narrowly avoided bankruptcy by selling itself to Bank of America at a fraction of its value. Meanwhile, insurance giant AIG faced its own fate. AIG had insured trillions of dollars in risky financial products. When the housing market collapsed, so did the securities AIG had guaranteed.
The $182 billion bailout of AIG in 2008, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury put U.S. taxpayers on the line for the full cost and risk.
The crisis quickly spread beyond U.S. borders. In Europe, banks with ties to U.S. securities faced devastating losses. In Japan, the Nikkei index plunged by 11% in a single day. In developing nations, the drop in demand for exports triggered mass layoffs. This was no longer just a financial crisis. It had become a global human crisis. Jobs disappeared, savings evaporated, and millions of families lost their homes. Entire nations faced economic devastation. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped by over 500 points in a single day, triggering panic among investors. By the end of 2008, global markets had lost an estimated $30 trillion in value, more than the combined GDP of the United States and Japan. Unemployment soared as businesses closed and governments imposed austerity measures. In the U.S., the unemployment rate hit 10% in 2009. Across Europe, the crisis triggered mass protests, with citizens demanding accountability from banks and governments. In October 2008, governments around the world stepped in with emergency measures. The U.S. passed the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, which created the $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, to stabilize the financial system. While TARP aimed to restore confidence, it also sparked public outrage. Many viewed it as a bailout for reckless bankers at the expense of taxpayers. The measures prevented a complete collapse but left deep scars on the global economy. The fallout from September 2008 would shape economic and political discourse for years to come. The collapse of 2008 wasn't just a financial failure, it was a failure of trust, governance, and oversight. The world would never look at the global economy the same way again. In the wake of one of the worst economic disasters in history, the world faced a daunting question. How could we rebuild? The road to recovery was long and fraught with challenges, but governments and central banks took bold, unprecedented steps to stabilize the global economy and restore confidence. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to subscribe Verdicts for more stories that shape the world.